Hey guys, Parfax here, and today we're doing another tier list. Today's tier list is going to be all around a PVE DPS or PVE expeditions. Now, we're going to preface this a couple different ways. We're not going to do just straight highest DPS. We're going to do the weapons you really want to see when you enter in a dungeon for DPS. So we're not going to put like the life staff. We're just going to go ahead and put it in the D category because it's not really a DPS and weapon, but it is a weapon. Of course, you want to see inside your dungeon, but you really don't want to see it as a DPS. There were some builds a long time ago that were like Life Staff Void Gauntlet for DPS, but we are way past that, and the video is going to be strictly about DPS. Now, we are going to take into account a little bit of utility, so it's not just going to be top DPS, second, third, fourth, fifth. We're going to go right down the list, but we're going to, not just to be DPS. You're going to see here, there's going to be some weapons that maybe do a lot of DPS that you think should be higher, going to be a little bit lower, and maybe some weapons that you think really don't do a whole lot of DPS, but they're higher than some weapons that do better DPS than it. Okay, first, let's talk about the blunderbuss. It is the first one here in the list, and honestly, the blender does a lot of burst damage, but its sustained damage really isn't there, and it doesn't really benefit from being a ranged weapon. Yes, it is ranged, but it's so short ranged that the typical mechanics that would hit you for being melee most of the time hit you for being the blunderbuss as well. So we're actually going to put this down here in the C category. This is a weapon that, of course, you can get through a dungeon with it, but you're never going to be happy to see a blunderbuss in your mutation group. Now, we are going to be talking mainly towards mutations because it is the harder content. You can probably get 5 life staff DPS builds and run through a lot of the normal dungeons, but we're specifically going to be talking about mutation dungeons. Next, we have the bow. And the bow, when it comes to range DPS, is probably the best. Even said that, we're probably just going to put it in a B. Now, the reason why I put it in a B and not A, or definitely not S, is because it just does okay damage, but provides no group utility at all. It has some dots, it has decent AoE damage. There's even a case to be made that there's some builds that should be running bow on their back bar, or as your secondary weapon, or your second weapon on your bar, over some others, and maybe I'll have a video about that here in the future. But the bow, unless you're doing damage against corruption, just isn't that good. And against corruption, it's fine. It's definitely something like if you're doing Dynasty, I would much rather see a bow player than a melee player. But the bow just, first off, doesn't have a second ranged weapon to pair it with. Like for instance, in PvP, fire, ice is always paired together because they're double ranged weapons. Now, you could say musket, but we'll talk about musket and its really bad deficiencies when we get there. But the bow just does decent damage, but has no group utility. Next, we have Ice Gauntlet. Ice, we're going to put, it's either C or B. We're going to put it in C. And here's why. There are a few dungeons. Do I put it in B? We're going to put it in B, and it's really close to C. I definitely don't think it's as good as bow, but there are a few dungeons where you can really utilize the Ice Gauntlet. And that is because if you pair it with something else, you can proc its, I believe it's Ultimate Chill passive with another weapon, and you can get the extra damage on it, and you're scaling ice in that weapon anyway, so it's a great secondary weapon. For instance, Barnacles, Hatchet, Ice Gauntlet is really good. Laz, Rapier, Ice Gauntlet is really good for just straight single target damage, but it really doesn't provide much damage itself, so that's why we're going to put it in the low B, high C category. It's okay to have them, but it's not something you want to see anywhere more than one of. Next, we have Fire Staff, which is kind of like the bow, and we're going to put it again in the B category. There's nothing special about the Fire Staff. Even in Genesis, it gets outperformed by a lot of different weapons. It has no group utility. It has no CC. It essentially just does dots, and that's it. And honestly, the way most people play Fire Staff, I would put it as a C. Most people play it as this super far back, we're going to heavy attack Fireball, Pillar of Fire, and it just really isn't that good. You really do need to be almost in the blunderbuss range to get those dots on there. The reason why I do put it above Blunder, even though you kind of still want to put it there, is it does have some really big AoE burst with things like Incinerate, has the Flamethrower, of course, it has Fireball, where Blunderbuss really just has grenades that does the AoE damage and everything else is single target. So the Fire Staff does a lot more AoE damage, but it still should be typically played more at that melee-ish playstyle. Now we're going to start getting into the melee weapons. Great Axe, we're definitely going to put it up here in the A. It does not do any crazy single target damage. Its single target damage is very mediocre. It is better than, you know, in most instances, ice, fire, and sometimes bow, depending on what you're doing. But the reason why the Great Axe is definitely up here in the A category is because it has Maelstrom, Gravity Well, and Reap. Those are the 3 abilities you should be running on your Great Axe, because if you're running Great Axe, you should be using it for more utility than anything else. It does okay damage, but you really just want to be able to group the mobs together. Your runs will always go more smooth if you have they'll go smoother if you have a Great Axe in your group, and a Great Axe is always something you want to see. Now, we're going to take the Great Sword, we're going to put it back here. We're going to take the hatchet, we're going to put it back here, and we're going to take the sword and put it back here. These are what people will always think is your top 3 DPS and weapons, so I want to kind of talk about them all together, but I want to kind of save that for last. So next we have Warhammer, and we're going to put Warhammer in the A category. Now, the one thing that I will say is everybody that wants you to spam Warhammer in Laz, Warhammer is not the highest DPSing weapon in Laz. It is like the 3rd or 4th highest DPSing weapon in Laz. DPS does not mean damage per hit. If it was damage per hit, yes, the Warhammer would be fantastic, but it is damage per second. Now, having said that, you do have some CC and rend capabilities on the Warhammer, which definitely puts it in the A category. Now, you probably are having your tank should be running Warhammer, and then you want max 1 other Warhammer in your group, pretty much no matter what dungeon you're running. You want 1 Great Axe, 1 Warhammer, and then you have the Warhammer on the tank, and then you are good. You can even get away with just having the tank run Warhammer, so I thought about putting it in the B category for that reason, but it doesn't do bad damage, and it's not a bad thing if you have 1 extra Warhammer in your group. You don't want to stack them because it just doesn't do quite the damage. And you should have enough damage to, once you get 1 round of CC in, crowd control, you should be able to nuke down all the mobs, especially in the ads. Next, this is an easy one, D. Don't use musket, don't use musket, don't use musket in PvE. Musket is absolutely trashed here. It is by far, I bet you I could get a build that has a life staff doing more damage than the musket. I'm almost guaranteeing you that I can get a life staff doing at least close to as much damage as the musket. The musket just has really bad reload times. Its abilities aren't the greatest. Yes, empowering shooter stance isn't bad. Sticky bombs can do some decent AoE. Powder burn gets a nice little dot on the target. So, you know, maybe it does more damage than the life staff, but it's just a weapon you never want to see in a dungeon. No matter what dungeon you're running, it's the reason why when I say, you know, the bow doesn't have a secondary weapon that you can pair it with. You can't pair it with musket, because the problem with musket is in order to even have it have slightly okay damage, you basically have to go 50 con or lower, where all of these other weapons, or some of these other weapons, you can still only go 300 and 200, 200 being into the Constitution, and still do pretty dang good damage. So musket, definitely a D category. Next, we have Rapier. Rapier is actually a tough one. The Rapier does way more damage than people give it credit for. It's actually one of the highest damaging weapons in the game. It's really close to Hatchet Sword. I know people don't want to say that, but problem is it has to have a lot of gear up time. You really need to get the bleed stacking. You need to get those things kind of, it's a dot build essentially. It's with 1 way to apply dots. But we're going to put Rapier in the B category. We're going to put it because it's kind of like Fire Staff, Bow, Ice Gauntlet, but it's like the melee version of it, because it just provides damage. It doesn't have really any group utility at all. Now, especially like Rapier Ice is a very deadly combo that you can run in pretty much any dungeon that doesn't have the ice mutation on it. It can be really good, but it is just damage. It doesn't really give you any tankiness. It does have Leeching Flurry, which is really good, And it is a very fun playstyle, in my opinion. You are spamming a ton of buttons. You're spamming your evade, your flurry, you're getting in your Tondo, and those are all really short cooldowns, and you will basically just be spamming them. So if you're really interested in a spamming playstyle where you're hitting a lot of buttons and not just basic attacking, the rapier is the weapon for you, but it doesn't really provide any utility or anything like that. Next, we have Spear. We're going to put Spear right up here in the A category. Now, when it comes to DPS, it's very decent. It's not incredibly busted, but it's not low by any means. It has Skewer for the extra dot. It has a weaken. It has triple rend with your, well, actually it's quadruple rend depending on how you build your Spear build, because it has Perforate, which each hit does a rend. It has Javelin Toss, if you have the perk, does rend. That's Fortify and Perforate. So the Spear is crazy decent. I don't know. It's really good. If you're looking for a tanky DPS weapon that provides group utility, the Spear is probably the best. Now, you might think Hatchet because it has this Defy Death and it has some Fortify on there as well. But the Spear, you will just be naturally tankier with the Spear than you will the Hatchet because you are getting that Fortify and Perforate. Now, without Fortify and Perforate, I wouldn't run it at all. It's not tanky at all. But with Fortify and Perforate, you're really good. You get that, I forget exactly, I think it might be like 30% Fortify if you hit each target. But you gain a lot of Fortify on the Spear. It's really good. It is just a very overall solid weapon. You don't really want to see more than one of these as well, sort of like the Great Axe Warhammer. But I would rather see a bunch of Spears than a bunch of, Ice Gauntlets or Fire Staves, Rapiers, all that kind of stuff, or even Warhammers. I'd rather see 4 Spears than 4 Warhammers. So, and that is what it is. Next, we have the Void Gauntlet, and we're going to put the Void Gauntlet here. We're going to put it in the B category, and that's because you want 1 to 2 Void Gauntlets in your group. The Void Gauntlet doesn't do a ton of damage at all. Your life staff user hopefully should be running Void Gauntlet on their back bar, and then a maximum of 1 other DPS running Void, specifically for Oblivion. Oblivion's great. Scream is meh. Orb is meh. We're really just looking for Oblivion. We just want to pump our damage as high as possible. The Void Gauntlet does that. As a straight DPSing weapon, it would definitely be down here in like the C category. It only has essentially Blade. Blade doesn't do horrible damage, but it doesn't really do crazy damage either. So we're going to put it here in the B category just because it's just really good. Next, we have Greatsword, Hatchet, and Sword. Now, we're going to rank Sword first because I think this is going to be a little bit controversial, and we're going to put it in the B category. Now, before you jump down my throat and tell me how much damage the Sword does, the Sword provides no group utility. I would rather have a, let's say, Void Gauntlet as our secondary weapon because we're just getting utility that's not going to provide us any damage at all. I would rather have a Void Spear than a Void Sword. 2 reasons. 1, if you're running Sword when you're on your back bar, or your bar that is not your sword and shield, you will have less defenses because you have to wear in order to be in light armor, you have to wear a light chest piece instead of a medium, which provides a lot of defense, more defense than people give it credit for. Second, the Sword is basically a basic attack weapon. That's all it does. All of its abilities provide no group utility, doesn't really give it any extra damage. You're sitting there and you're just spamming your basic attack. You do get a little bit of defenses, but in order to get the defenses, you have to sacrifice some offensive capabilities. I mean, I guess you could, maybe we could do this in the future, do a Sword and Shield DPS build where we don't take any abilities on the Sword. We just take every passive. We get the leadership. Now, when they did the leadership, or when they did the DPS test for the Sword, they took into account the leadership buff, which if you're running with a good tank should already have the leadership buff. So, and in the test that they talked about, they actually didn't take into account a couple Hatchet passives that really push the Hatchet even further up the DPS list. So you should be getting the 10% the buff from this leadership sword on your Hatchet already. If you haven't seen my tanking video, make sure you go and watch it because your tank should be running that side of the tree anyway. So you should be getting the 10% damage bonus on the Hatchet, and the Hatchet is just, I would much rather have a Hatchet in every circumstance than Sword. I'd much even rather have an Axe, Warhammer, or Spear other than Sword. Now, when it comes to this category, it's pretty much up there. And I'm a sword lover. I love sword and shield. But when it comes to DPS in the dungeons, it's still something you really don't want to see that much. All right, so next we have greatsword and hatchet. Now, we're only going to put one weapon up here in S tier. We're going to have it as like the best weapon, the weapon you want to see. And honestly, you know what it is. It's hatchet. Now, we will talk about why greatsword isn't up here, because yes, greatsword does do more damage. There's a couple things that the hatchet has going for it. First off, you have natural fortify, and you have fortify that doesn't sacrifice for damage. Now, when it comes to the hatchet, you have, of course, your defy death, which we talked about. You have berserk, which gives you heals. You have rending throw, which gives you rend. I know the greatsword does have a rend, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But the hatchet just gives you tankiness from there's a passive that when you basic attack 3 times, you get fortify, and you're just naturally tanky with the hatchet. You also have really good AoE with refreshing torrent, which that gets a lot better if you know, there's some specific hatchet builds out there that even put it on their weapon. But the hatchet is just overall a super safe. I would rather have every DPS running hatchet than greatsword, and here is why. So we're going to put greatsword here in the A tier. Now, of course, it's definitely the best of the A tier. It is better than axe, warhammer, or spear. It is the best. It is the highest damaging weapon in the game. But here's the issue, and you will start to see this. People are just going to die a lot with greatsword. People, to proc their abilities, you have crosscut, which is the highest damaging ability in the game, which people constantly just get killed in. You take 15% more damage. So when you're running mutations, you just have regular dots taken on you, or random mobs will just hit you. And people just die a lot as a greatsword user. Now, you can make the argument that if you want to go more of the defensive side of the tree, you can actually be very tanky and still perform crazy well. But if you do that, then you can't actually get the rend like the hatchet has. The hatchet can use the rend more often as well, so they can have the rend time up a little bit more. And the greatsword does have fortify, but it has fortify on the tanky side. So in order to proc the fortify, you have to use an ability and then use another ability to swap back over or do your heavy attack. But if you're using the heavy attack passive, then you're actually taking a passive that doesn't just give you damage. So it's a very odd play style. I can definitely see if you want to put the greatsword up here in the S category, but the reason why I'm not, like I said, is just because you were going to die with the greatsword. People, I've been running mutations, and people are just getting killed because they're taking 15% extra damage. Where in the hatchet, you're taking no extra damage, but you're actually taking less because you just have a fortify and you're healing yourself. And if you mess up, you have defy death. So that's the reason why we're putting the hatchet in the S tier. It is the reason why when you see people spamming dungeons, if they're asking for one specific weapon, it's going to be hatchet. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe. Like always, let me know in the comment section down below where you rank these weapons. We only had one C category weapon, and we definitely could have had some more down there. We definitely could have put Ice Gauntlet down there. Honestly, we could have put Void or even Sword down here. But we're going to keep it the way it is. So let me know in the comment section down below where I went right and where I went wrong. All right, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Peace.